So, welcome to Garden Masterclass. Garden Masterclass is run by myself, Annie Guilfoyle, and Noel Kingsbury. And we started this about 4 years ago, the idea being to hold live events all over the British Isles and into mainland Europe in interesting gardens, nurseries, different venues, with the very best people from the industry, from garden design, horticulture, landscape architecture, garden history, nursery owners, plants people, and that's been all going tremendously well. But of course, this year we've had to postpone a lot of our events due to the dreaded COVID virus. So we've now started offering a lot more online. We have our online free talks on YouTube, on the YouTube channel, and we have pay-to-view videos on Vimeo. For all the information on up-and-coming webinars and anything that we've done or are about to do, you need to go to our website, which is www.gardenmasterclass.org. And also on the website is our email address, which is gardenmasterclass@gmail.com. And you can email us for any questions, or if you'd like to be on our mailing list. And we send out usually about 2 newsletters a month, just to keep you updated with what's coming up, current news, what's new, and anything exciting to tell you.
Great, thanks Annie. So this YouTube broadcast is a recording of one of our Thursday garden chats, which happen at 6 o'clock London time every Thursday, which was a weekly continuation of the 5-day-a-week broadcasts we ran during lockdown. Now, we do these for free because we feel it's important they're kept free for people on furlough, students, people on low income, and people indeed in poorer countries. We don't want to charge for them, which does mean that if you can afford to give us something to contribute towards our running costs and our time, that will be very much appreciated. So there is a donations button on the online page of our website, gardenmasterclass.org. So enjoy this particular recording. So it gives me great pleasure this evening to welcome Alasdair Forbes, who I met probably around about 10 years ago, when it was suggested to me by a mutual friend that perhaps it would be interesting to go and visit his garden. Alasdair has created in North Devon a truly extraordinary garden. One of those gardens that is actually really quite a challenge to know how to frame, how to describe, how to introduce. And the way I'm going to introduce it is to make comparisons, which I kind of feel are possibly ones that Alasdair may not be that happy with, but it's the best way in. Now, most of us have heard of Little Sparta and Charles Jenks's garden, the Garden of Cosmic Speculation. I can never remember that. The Garden of Speculation, yes. Now, those 2 gardens achieved a status that was really quite unique, which was, as for want of a better word, intellectual gardens, gardens that were making statements about a much wider world than simply making a garden. I have been to both of them. I found both Little Sparta and the Garden of Cosmic Speculation very intense, very crowded, very restless. Alasdair's garden is quite the opposite. It is an extraordinarily restful, calm space, and yet it is a garden that is full of meaning. What Alasdair has essentially done, I feel, is to relate his very extensive love of Western culture and philosophy, and increasingly other philosophies, non-Western philosophies, his whole Weltanschauung, if you like, into his garden space. So, Alasdair, what was it that made you choose the garden as your métier?
Well, no, good evening, Annie, and everybody watching. I'm delighted to be able to speak to you. First of all, before I answer that question, which I will try to answer, I'd just like to explain, because I didn't do it in my presentation, what the garden, physically, what the garden is. So it's about 32 acres or 13 hectares, and it's about between 500 and 600 feet above sea level. and the soil is mainly slightly acid, although in the walled garden it's alkaline. And on the south-facing side of the valley, there is topsoil of at least 2 foot or 0.6 of a meter. Unfortunately, for aesthetic reasons, that wasn't the side of the valley that I really wanted to do so much planting on. But on the opposite side of the valley, where I have planted more, it's only about 6 inches of topsoil over clay, so it's less well drained there. I'm in a frost hollow, so I have recorded -17 in the walled garden. And this year, on the 13th of May, I was -3. So these are always setbacks if you're a gardener when you get those late frosts. And I'm in a bit of a wind funnel. And I've noticed that rainfall here actually in the last few years is rather less than the historical average of about 50 inches or 1.30 meters. So having got that out of the way, why did I want to make a garden? And this is quite a hard question for me to unravel. My early experience of gardens was very restricted to Portman Square in central London, where I was brought up, and the London parks. Not so auspicious a start for a gardener, perhaps. It was while I was studying the history of art at the Courtyard Institute, also then in Portman Square, funnily enough, that I discovered gardens. I had first discovered art when I was about 20, doing an earlier degree, and this was life-changing for me, and began a long process of self-education that extended to literature and philosophy, and still goes on today. My discovery of gardens was always interwoven with so much else. So I would leave London for a day or a longer period of time to go and expressly to visit gardens at somewhere in the UK. And then I would come back, and I was doing maybe an in-depth study of Kierkegaard or Wordsworth, and then teaching, as I was an art historian, I would maybe teaching the Quattrocento. So you can see how gardens were woven into this fabric. And I tried to be a serious student of everything, though I found I wasn't really suited to an academic career. And with me, it's always been a question of how to lead my life, really. And so although self-imposed, the pressures were considerable. And I felt challenged to respond in kind to what I loved. And I was constantly chastened by what I failed to understand, which was more or less everything. At this time, gardens were refreshing retreats for me. I loved their forgiving, porous atmospheres. And furtively, they gave me unaccustomed permissions. And gradually, this redemptive permissiveness worked its way through to the foreground of my life's possibilities. Before starting to make a garden, I lived for 2 years in the Lake District. I rented the house of a friend of mine who'd gone to live in Provence. And this had quite a big garden, and there were 2 full-time gardeners, and it was in a magnificent setting at the northern end of Coniston Water, overlooking the lake and the Old Man. And while I was there, I really learned the rhythm of the gardening year, you might say. And it was also it was a time of really intense seclusion, which I loved. So that was a preparation for the coronavirus and that. And this seclusion taught me that I not only could, but I needed to be somewhere on my own with space. So why space and not nature? Well, of course, it's both. But I'm going to prioritize space this evening because it's the medium, first of all, out of which a garden is made. And second, in some ways, for me, space is even prior to nature, because space is what entitles us or enables us to move and to breathe. And I never whenever I possibly can, I like to remember that fact. And yet it seems to me that it's very little mentioned in either gardening or environmental literature. At least not in the same way that it is in with the sort of quiet awe and humility that it's mentioned in a Buddhist meditation exercise, where with each incoming breath you recite space, and with each outgoing exhalation you recite freedom. And I wonder actually if there is any deeper freedom than that, and where better than a garden to acknowledge it. So after my time in the lakes, as soon as the opportunity arose, I left London to make a garden of my own. And this was my second life-changing event after the discovery of art. I'm really going, Noel, on to a sort of second question that I thought you might have asked me. I'm preempting you. So in other words, I'm going to try and say why, what else is going on in the garden beyond what one normally expects to be going on in a garden, and to make a kind of defense of that, I suppose you could say. So I fully respect that for many gardeners, their gardens are self-sufficient worlds, sometimes a little bit designed, sometimes not, but essentially cherished environments for growing plants. And this is a thrill that I share myself, but I can hardly claim, I'm afraid, to be a plantsman. And for better or worse, a self-sufficient garden of this kind was never really an option for me, because the way my love of gardens emerged was always so intimately interwoven with my other loves of art, myth, psychology, wisdom teachings, literature, and so on. Now, in that sentence, perhaps loves is the word to emphasize. When a garden introduces alien content today, that is, whenever it uses a vocabulary that is supplementary to that of water and plants and the atmospheres they create, it's quickly branded as intellectual or conceptual, and somehow quarantined from the main gardening community as a bit of an aberration. In the context of contemporary gardening, I think this is probably inevitable. But from my point of view, and perhaps from the point of view of gardens overall in the long run, this schismatic approach may not be so helpful. Isolating gardens from other cultural interests and branding all these interests as intellectual ignores the many other factors that may be at play, such as imagination, poetic reflection, psychological insight, historic association, political concern, all those things, for instance, and more. And so I want to say, isn't it anyway quite artificial to ring fence the love of gardens from other loves, as if the way we love could be compartmentalized instead of being experienced along a continuum. So culturally important gardens, it seemed to me, never used to be quarantined off like this. Because a garden is a wondrously sensuous environment and a place that inspires great generosity of feeling, which are things that nobody would ever wish a garden to dispense with. I mean, those are absolutely basic, but need that deprive it of using imagination and reflection in terms of what it has to say. Great gardens all over the world plead the opposite case. The Villa Lante and Yuan in Suzhou, for example, which has the wonderful name of the garden which lingers between heaven and earth. We regret, quite rightly, that the arts establishment is reluctant to take gardens entirely seriously. But maybe we have to ask, aren't gardens in part themselves responsible for this, if they so jealously guard the limits of their cultural concerns? The deeply humane and great Jewish philosopher Spinoza, a humble lens grinder by trade, ended his greatest work, the Ethics, with the words, "All noble things are as difficult as they are rare." The history of gardens teaches us that gardens can be noble as well as seductive. And this shouldn't, I don't think this should be an either or. But alas, it's in danger of becoming so if we continue to insist that a garden should operate through the narrowest of cultural wavelengths. So my garden has quite a broad cultural wavelength, but this just happened because there were so many cultural influences I wanted to include in the garden, and many of the gardens I most admired were available to wide culture as well. But you know, when I was starting to make the garden, I was just in my own world. I was certainly not trying to make any sort of poem. I don't think I imagined anybody would ever have any interest in my garden except me and maybe my close friends. So I mean, I was certainly not trying to make a point. But sometimes I wonder if it's not the expectation of happiness we have inherited which makes us antipathetic to or neglectful of cultural ambition in the gardens we make today. And perhaps my willingness in the garden to commemorate a poem by Lorca or a play by Euripides or what Chuang Tzu in his wonderful parable of the butterfly calls the transformation of material things, or indeed, you know, a rumor of Psyches or Orpheuses or alchemies, that there is a dark and unaccountable and sometimes disenchanted side to life. I mean, perhaps these commemorations trespass on this expectation of happiness that we have. And yet, you know, if we let go of this particular ideal of happiness as an unthinking and an untrained contentment, and substitute for it the Greek ideal of eudaimonia, or in China, the attunement to the Tao, each of which means something like human flourishing as the most fulfilling way to be in a garden, then I think that inclusiveness of the imagination, of deep thoughtfulness, of poetic courage, of seasoned equanimity, to name but a few of the more accurate descriptions of what is going on in culturally ambitious gardens than intellectual or conceptual can ever hope to convey, then perhaps this inclusiveness may become revalued more charitably as a virtue rather than a vice. So I wanted to bring things together as I made the garden. I didn't want my love of Hidcote or Rauschem or Courance to be separate from my love of Rilke or Poussin or Simone Weil or Psyche. But these, of course, these are just my own cultural preferences, and in all likelihood, my attempt to integrate them into the fabric of the garden fails in many respects. But if it does, I just would like to ask you not to let my failure tarnish this ideal of allowing gardens to become again companions to and vessels of eudaimonia and the wholeness of being, because I think gardens actually are the most perfect environments for allowing that to happen. So that's my opening. Speaking of Greece and eudaimonia, what we see here is a slide of the theatre at Epidaurus in Greece. And for me, Epidaurus is an exemplary place in terms of how it brings space and meaning together. It was essentially a place of healing. The main sanctuary was for Asclepius, who was the god of healing, and he healed the body and perhaps the soul, while the amazing tragedies that were performed in the theatre, and comedies too, were therapy for the anguish of the mind. Keeping the bar high, this is Studley Royal in Yorkshire, which wasn't the first garden that became a real revelation for me when I was studying art history. That was Hidcote Manor. But once I had discovered Studley, it became, and probably remains, my favourite garden in England. So I had very little practical experience of gardening when I came to Coombe House, and my parents had a cottage in Hampshire where I fiddled around with herbaceous borders, but I was born and raised in central London, so the experience of gardening was quite alien to me, and nobody in my family was in the least interested in gardening. However, I spent a couple of decades in between teaching art history, visiting and studying gardens, and generally trying to educate myself. So what we're looking at here is the central mise-en-scène at Studley Royal, the Temple of Piety with the moon ponds in the front, and in the foreground is the River Skell, which has been exquisitely turned into a canal. I love the nobility of this garden and the clarity of it and the sheer improbability of it in this setting. And yet, that improbability doesn't seem out of place. On the contrary, it manages to reveal the valley in a way that is altogether unique. And it is that capacity of gardens to reveal their genius loci in a particularly affecting way that touches me so much. And what I love best is when a garden can be completely transforming. So this is the canal at Studley. Now you're looking along it rather than across it. And higher up the river and in the same garden is Fountains Abbey. So altogether a completely wonderful place, I would say a sacramental place. However, between the idea and the reality lies the shadow. So this is what the valley at Coombe House looked like when I arrived, or this is after a year, because the whips you see in the foreground I planted in 1993. The valley is in the dip and the house is in this dip. So what you're, in this photograph, you're looking at the same view, but I planted a wood which has screened a lot of the distance off. And what you see here is the beginning of the walk I landscaped, the pastoral loop that goes round the valley above on both sides. The first tree turning red is Acer autumn blaze, and the one behind is Fraxinus raywood. This is the center of the valley when I arrived. So as you can see, everything was really just bare pasture, but it was quite pure in that the stream went right down through the middle of the valley, and there were a few established trees, which was agreeable. I was lucky that they were there even. And this is really how the Central Valley looks today. So the ash tree at the end of the lake is still recognizably the same, but everything else is pretty different. And here we see what the garden looks like on Google Earth. And it's quite interesting how clearly some things show up. Where you see the buildings, please notice the very rectangular format in which they are, and there's even a little courtyard inside the larger rectangle. Google has kindly indicated where the lake is for us. And you can imagine that when the stream ran straight down the middle, it actually goes round the lake now. The valley was very symmetrical. It was 2 fields wide either side of the central stream. So that's the way the garden looks from above. And here is a general view of the valley. So you're looking from the north, from the south towards the northwest, with the lake obviously at the center of the valley. And here's another view of the center of the valley as it is today. This is a plan of the garden that is very much modeled on Google Earth. And you can see that there are about nearly 40 names of areas in the garden, which are all listed down in the bottom right of the plan. And what I want to draw attention to is that you've seen how the valley is fairly classical in that it's a real V-shaped open valley when I came here. And that was one inherent shape that I inherited. The other one was this quadrangle, where the numbers 3, 4 and 5 are, which contains the walled garden and 2 courtyards with the house at the front. So I want to show you what the quadrangle looks like. This is, as you come down the drive, this shows you the corner of the walled garden and the house. And then this photograph shows you how the walled garden extends towards the barns of the larger courtyard. And there's actually a little courtyard beyond that. So what I'm going to do next is show you the front garden and then take you into the 3 enclosed gardens behind the house. So this is the house, and this photograph is taken from the little area known as Mnemosyne, who was the goddess of memory. And this rustic bridge was made for me by an older friend of my trusted gardener, Cyril. So that is quite a conventional view, really, of the front of the house. And to the left, the bridge crosses a canal. And now you can see the canal long ways on. And Malus floribunda is coming into blossom just in front of the copper beech. So when I arrived at Coombe House, the drive came right round to the front of the house, but I took that away and placed this little terrace there instead. And although this looks quite insignificant and modest, it's actually quite a big change, because the little terrace is making a gesture of tribute to its surroundings, which I call a votive space. And even the empty urns in this photograph are quite expressive of this gesture of tribute. So now I'm going to take you into the enclosed gardens. This is the walled garden after I had sprayed the main flower bed, but not the others. The walls are made of mud and straw, as is traditional in a Devon walled garden. A little summer house was built projecting out of the wall at the top, and there were paths which had to be excavated because the whole garden was really pretty derelict. So I'm now going to show you, I think, 3 photographs after planting, just to give you an idea. So this is the side path as opposed to the central one. And you can see that there are several lines of box which divide the larger bed, and at the top there's a kind of star of box, all on the left-hand side of the garden. And Cyril cuts these yews into the shapes you see with great pride. And the bare-leaved tree is a rather architectural tree, a little elm called Ulmus Jacqueline Hillia. This is the main path in the walled garden, and this would be in June. On the right, the shrub is Physocarpus diabolo, and on the left you can see some white foxgloves. If you look hard, there's some white gladiolus, some agapanthus which are not yet in flower, and at the very top, at the end of the rose arches, if you're very sharp-eyed, you might just see a little bit of the pink rose, Zéphirine Drouin, which is jutting out in front of the summer house. And this is another bed in the walled garden, just to show you the kind of profusion. It's really a cottage garden. And so you've got some alstromerias here, some veronica, a few eschscholtzias, and some clipped cotinus. So the next garden is the main courtyard. And you're looking at it here when I'd sprayed the grass, and I, in fact, discovered under the foreground grass some cobbles. The metal fence was there because that lawn was for the tenant farmer who lived in a cottage that joins the house just to the left, while the main farmyard was obviously used by animals and general farm function. So that was the main barn, a rather imposing structure. And although it looks very tall, at the back, the first floor is actually on ground level. So when I removed the grass, there I found those lovely cobbles, which you see in the foreground. So that gives a fairly good impression of the courtyard as it exists today. And we shall come back to that courtyard. And then this is the third little courtyard, rather unusual. And what you see is a hayloft above the entrance. And I replaced concrete with this Italian porphyry, which I very much recommend. It's a kind of granite and never becomes slippery in the winter. And you can see on the left, high up, a mimosa, Acacia bravissima. And the only other plant really in the ground is the honeysuckle you can see facing you. This is in April when the mimosa is in flower, and you can also see the Minotaur, who is engraved onto one of the doors in the loft. So those are the three gardens, but I'm just going to show you two more of the main courtyard, which is the central space. And what you're looking at in the front is a labyrinth laid out on the gravel. And you can also see against the barn to the right opposite some clipped filaria and a wisteria, but most of the planting in the courtyard is evergreen. And here you can see that there are two climbing magnolias, Goliath on the left, and to the far right on the wall Exmouth, with a Stauntonia in between, which has deliciously scented flowers in May. Not very conspicuous, but well worth growing just for the scent of the flowers. I came to realize that at least I asked myself, how can I integrate this very quadrangular space of these three enclosed gardens, which together I called the distress retort, and the open V of the valley. This was one of the major design challenges I felt that I had to try to resolve. And I came to the conclusion that the garden was really composed of three vessels, the outer one of which is the open valley, which is most accessible when you are walking around the path I mentioned that takes you around on the high up on both sides of the valley. And then you have the distress retort, which is the most introspective one, the place of intense withdrawal and introversion. And I tried in the distress retort to I tried to think about enclosure and the many different meanings that enclosure can have. And I didn't want enclosure just to be a conventional paradise of growing sheltered plants. I wanted to investigate its darker sides as well. And so I would say that in the flower garden, I used enclosure quite conventionally, where the atmosphere of enclosure is a kind of antidote to distress, you might say. In the little courtyard, on the contrary, distress becomes exacerbated, and it assumes a quite oppressive foreground appearance, which I don't have time to go into. And then in the middle, we have the central courtyard, where Hermes distills his spatial magic, which coaxes a kind of release, but you have to work for it, but it coaxes a kind of release out of a basically distressing situation. So these are three different ways in which the enclosed gardens have a different temperament, if you like. But between the very introverted enclosed gardens and the wide upper valley and the views down onto the whole valley, there is the central main garden. And this vessel is like a cradle, really. So when you are here, you can almost sense that you are listening to a lullaby, or that the two hillsides are gently rocking you as if you were in a cradle. So this was the mediating vessel between the wide expanses of the pastoral loop and the introspective spaces of the distress retort. So I'm just going to show you again two views of the open valley, both taken from the south towards the north. This one is slightly further east than the next one, so you're still basically looking down over the lake. But in the next one, you are further along the valley, and you're looking, the lake is now out of sight to the right. And you look across, and this is the most expansive view you get in the garden. You're looking north towards Exmoor. And you can see in the field opposite what I call the Avenue of the Hours. And there are four crab trees in flower. Two are Malus hupehensis, and two are Malus manchurica. And the rather pale yellowy green tree is, I think, if I'm right, Tilia wrocławiensis. And also in that field you can see the Atlantic bow, a semicircle of stone that is carved into the field to help counteract the downward diagonal of the avenue. And in the foreground you see the horns of the rather monumental Pan figure that is set into the hillside on this side of the valley. So that is the wide valley. However, valleys are, for me, very important and became increasingly so the longer I stayed here. And at heart, valleys have a dark and mysterious nature, particularly because they tend to converge on depth. And I became very intrigued and influenced by the Taoist understanding of the valley, which you can read about very explicitly in the Tao Te Ching, for example. And in complement to this idea that the valley is a kind of ravine under everything that is, and a gateway into the how to live life most fully. In complement to that Eastern idea, in the West too, valleys have always been important and associated with the soul. Indeed, valleys, since the 23rd Psalm, we could say, are the domiciles of the soul traditionally. And what in this slide you're looking down, this time you're looking from the north towards the south, so across the valley in the opposite direction. You're in the avenue that you were looking at from above just now, and you're looking down onto the Eleusis enclosure in the center of the garden. And I always think of this enclosure, particularly in autumn, as the black pearl of the garden. It's also very close to the soul, because Eleusis celebrated the mysteries of Demeter and Persephone, of mother and daughter, and how the continuity of life in both a material and ineffable sense, from the female point of view, was essential to the life of the soul. And you can just make out, perhaps, just beyond the yellow leaf tree in the center, you can just see a slim silver line. And that silver line, if we look in this photograph, is the sail, the Notsegel, alarm sail, which represents Psyche. Psyche and I am in a valley, we are in a valley, Plaz Metaxu, the place that is between, occupies a valley. And Psyche, the soul, is the domicile. The valley is the domicile of the soul. This slide shows you more clearly the relationship of Psyche to the Eleusis enclosure. While Psyche, the soul, enjoys the depth of the valley, the poor Eternus, the eternal youth or the spirit, takes an opposite view, and he prefers the axis of the valley, and particularly where the axis opens out into a large open space. because the spirit, the pua, enjoys height and speed and distance, complete opposite to the soul, which remembers and is patient and is prepared to enter the dark depths of life. Well, at this point in the garden, for the first time after being in the enclosed gardens, you reach the open landscape around the lake, and this is the moment that the pua feels exalted. So there is a little statue of Pegasus to suggest how we all might want to take off with the pua into the distance, being thrilled by the sudden open light landscape in front of us. Even the lawns, when they're seen axially, only when they're seen axially, take on a pua characteristic. In other words, they almost become runways. Now, if you look at the right-hand side of the lawn, in other words, to the right of the stream, there the pua will race towards what he sees as the highest ground, which is this little mound of orexis that was made from spare topsoil when we excavated the lake. However, when he gets to orexis, as you can just see in that slide, onward movement is blocked. And what happens is, on orexis, you cannot go further forward, instead of which what happens is that you are only available to cross views or reverse views. And these views are the ones that Psyche prefers. The white cross in the ground is a kind of way of tying together the perspectives of the spirit and the soul. So if the pua, the eternal youth, if he is coming from the left along the axis of the valley, at this point, when the view is blocked, his freedom of movement is stopped, and in fact his entire project fails, and he crashes to the ground, and what you see are the spread-eagled wings of Icarus fallen to the ground. However, from Psyche's point of view, and you can see the sail across the lake, in other words, from the transverse point of view, as opposed to the axial one, Psyche has just landed on this mound in the form of a white butterfly. So the cross has changed its nature from Psyche's point of view. In Greek, the word Psyche means both soul and butterfly. And in order to see Psyche's perspective, we can get it in this slide. So you can see how she is pining in almost in the way of the troubadours, a kind of outre-mer or across the sea longing to be on the Mount of Eros, who is the exemplar of the spirit or the pua that Psyche is in love with. And you can see how she's tentatively succeeded in crossing the water and landing on Eros's mount. So these two spatial, this love affair between Psyche and Eros, or the soul and the spirit, is told in the garden also in terms of the differing spatial momentum of, on the one hand, following an axis, a straightforward, forward-moving dynamic, and on the other hand, Psyche's dimension, which is always crossways on, or preferring to delve into depth, or to reverse things, or to enjoy reciprocal exchanges, but something that is very different from the compulsive need to progress in a forward straight line. I like, in fact, to say that Psyche does not really see or understand life as a journey, which is, on the whole, what we are encouraged to do. She understands it more as a vessel. And if you garden in a valley, as I do, I came gradually to the understanding that the whole premise of the garden is actually for detaining and probing this vessel that is life. So now I'm going to take you back to the plan. And so we have seen a central drama of the main garden. But now I want to just say a word or two about the polytheistic organization of the spaces in the garden. So as I mentioned, there are about 40 areas. And the main idea is that there is an equality between them, and they don't all fit together in some kind of hierarchical plan. And the general framework of the valley holds everything together. And we've seen that there is a central dynamic between axis and bilaterality. And also laid onto that is this equality of many spaces, all adjusting to each other in, I hope, quite rewarding, if complex ways. And one of the ways I want to discuss now is between the Hades Courtyard, which is number 4, and we've been there already on this plan, and the Hermes Courtyard, number 4, and Hades, which is number 18, the circle south of the lake. And these two areas, which have a lot of importance in the garden, they are quite intense focal weights. They balance each other across the axis of the valley. That's how I would like you to imagine it. That's a kind of spatial arrangement that suits a polytheistic arrangement very well. So I'm going to take you first of all back. You remember what the Hermes Courtyard looks like. In the foreground here we have the labyrinth of the broken heart, which I will explain a bit more about in a moment. But I just want to introduce you to Hades as well, which unfortunately is not very photographic. You can only get details of it. But here is the entrance to Hades, and it takes the form of a yew hedge in a circle around a completely empty, lawned space. Surrounding it are some quite richly planted glades. And here is an internal view, a detail in the winter that has a quite Rothko-like abstract appearance to it. We're now looking at the labyrinth of the broken heart in Hermes. And you can see, I hope, that the labyrinth is made by a question mark on the right-hand side and a musical ear on the left-hand side. And in the middle, there is the pot, which is Hermes' oracle, with a very dark mouth. Hermes was known as the magic darkness in the midst of bright sunlight. And amongst his other roles was the one of escorting the soul to Hades after death. So you see, there is a thematic link already between the Hermes Courtyard and Hades across the lake. But if I might ask you now to focus on the round mouth and the lines of the question mark, and then to look at this photograph taken early on, before anything was planted on the other side of the lake, you can, I hope, see that the circle of Hades and the peripheral hedge which encloses Hades and its surrounding glades pick up on the themes and shapes of the mouth of the pot and the question mark. You will notice, no doubt, how bare the landscape is. And in this next slide, I just want to show you a more recent view, very similar view, and you can just make out the circle of Hades right in the middle of the photograph. The next area I want to look at in a little more detail is number 10 on the map, and this is Epidaurus, named after the theatre, you remember, I mentioned at the beginning. If you look at where it's positioned, you can see that it's between the quadrangle of the enclosed gardens and the open lawns, and they're around the lake, number 13, and the lake is number 16. So in one of its guises, Epidaurus is a space of transition. And this is how it appears from the foot of the drive, a kind of gesture of welcome and invitation into the main garden. You might just be able to notice as well that the hedges in the foreground are echoed or rhymed with some similar rounded hedges beyond the trunks of the pines on the other side of the lake, another way of unifying the main garden. Towards the right of this photograph, there is this imposing yew hedge planted in 1994. And this helps give a sense of integrity and theatre to Epidaurus. And you remember that there is this very famous theatre at Epidaurus. And I just want to say at this point that, picking up on the theme of that Epidaurus was such an important place of healing, and notice how the setting lends a horizon of dignity to all the other kinds of healing that were going on there, and adds a very important one of its own, which I think a garden is well advised to try to pick up on. And for me, spatial poise is one of the ways in which a garden performs a very important act of healing, although it's quite an unobtrusive one. But I think it's very much a major part of a garden's duty of care. And this is Epidaurus seen from the lakeside, so you're looking back towards the house in this photograph. And the house would be behind the copper beech tree you see in the center, and the yew hedge we were just looking at would be to the left, beyond the upright hornbeam that is just beginning to turn yellow on the top. So back to the plan again, and the next area I just want to look at in a little detail is number 15 on the map. That's Ananke, and you can see Ananke has a ha-ha. The ha-ha is shaped just between the letter F and the number 15. The ha-ha is round. And Ananke represents the end of the garden proper, if you are looking at the garden from the point of view of the axis of the valley. And this shows you a photograph of Ananke from the field Hesperos just beyond it. And Ananke is shaped like a noose. The ha-ha is semicircular. That is continued by the beech hedge. But the stream, which is actually right in the foreground, the straight line in the foreground of the photo, the stream in fact curves back round to the left, and so the only approach to Ananke from the main garden is down quite a narrow grass path, and so this gives the appearance of Ananke as a whole, the one of a noose, really, the noose of necessity. She was the goddess of necessity. So it's quite appropriate that she is connected with an area concerned with endings. In all sorts of ways, most of which I don't have time to speak about, I like to treat garden motifs honor their traditional usages and try to add new ones. And so the ha-ha is an example of that, and I can only mention one thing that is going on here among many. You're looking now from the lake dam over Ananke towards the distance, and in this photograph I would just like you to take notice of the fact that the distance recedes away from us and invites our probing gaze in the way distances traditionally do. However, in this photograph, and again, you're nearer to being in Ananke at this point. You're looking over the ha-ha, but this time towards the corner of the field of Hesperos, where Asa, October glory, is turning this crimson. And you notice in this photograph how the triangular mound, a Zen ben as I call it, echoes the shape of the top of the field and helps to bring this distance towards us, in fact. So it operates in a very different way from the distance we were just looking at. And I find space is very important in this way, in how it reveals so many different things about ourselves, actually. And when distance comes towards us, which it's not supposed to do, but does sometimes, I think we can then speak of it having a soul horizon as opposed to a natural horizon. And an example of the soul horizon is that death, for example, comes nearer. It doesn't disappear, it comes nearer. And again, it's very much part of the tradition of the soul that she has a very special relationship with death. So now I'm going to go, for one last time, I'm going to point out the area 31, which is called Coranzuela, and we're going to look at that. This is an alcove or lookout in the North Wood. So you can see that it's there below number 29. And this is the North Wood, seen from the other side of the valley. And Coranzuela would be, you can see there's a cotoneaster hedge that loops around the wood. And the leftmost loop has a little gap in it, and that's where Coranzuela looks out from. And this is the lookout in Coranzuela. And so, as with the ha-ha, with the lookout, I very much like to use the garden motif and to invest it with new meanings. I find that's important. So the name Coranzuela is taken from a priory in Andalusia where the 16th century saint and poet John of the Cross spent a short time. He loved to, from a confined space, to look out on expansive landscapes. And he was also the author of many works that document the dark night of the soul in its most authentic, mystical version. So I am moved by this dialogue between the intense inwardness of the soul and its longing at the same time for expanse. And I think the Garden Lookout in general stages this drama in its own way, but not perhaps taking it to the extremes that I am fond of doing. It's not only John of the Cross, however, who I associate with this lookout. It has a mythological referent as well, and he is Chiron. Now, Chiron was the centaur, the tutor of the heroes, and a great healer, until one day, in a terrible accident, his friend Hercules shot him with a poisoned arrow, and his perfect nature was divided. And Chiron retired to his cave, unable to cure himself and unable to die. And in the summer, as this photograph shows, Coranzuela has a rather cave-like tone. It really gets quite dark. And Chiron is very important in this part of the garden. And I think the lookout, as it stands for all kinds of dialogues between binary relationships, whether they're to do with visionary and realities and sensuous ones, or between remedies and wounds, or prospects and refuges, or light and dark, open and closed, the creaturely and the illuminated, the finite and the immortal. All these and others come into play for me in a garden lookout. And I I would encourage you really to allow yourself to imagine all these options when you go to gardens and find yourself in these privileged vantage points. And Corinzuela also refers to Orpheus, who is the archetypal poet and musician, who is also very important in the garden. And on two symmetrically placed stones, we have quotations from Rilke's sonnets to Orpheus. Say to the constant earth I'm flowing, to the running water speak I am. So again, this dialogue between different relationships, this time of flow and stasis. In fact, when in wet seasons, this little waterfall on the far shore of the lake arrives again. It tends to go dry in the summer and broadcasts its music, perhaps like Orpheus, to the valley. And so it's true that at a certain time of year you do see running water, not just the lake, but you do actually see running water from Corinzuela. While on the other hand, the sail, the soul, the I, which here represents I am, a more constant presence. And the soul, the sail in the garden is really a kind of antenna for all the transactions that might occur between the soul and space. So I've tried to give you a very brief and incomplete sketch of the kinds of things that Plaz Metaxu is about. But Noel has asked me if I would also indicate some of the materials and artifacts in the garden that might be of use for people, or they might like to adopt some of the ideas perhaps in their own garden. Well, I'm just showing you Derek Jarman's garden at Prospect Cottage to show how objets trouvés, whether they're metal or driftwood or whatever it might be, can actually be used to some effect in a garden. And they don't have to be expensive objects. That's a very important point. So these are the dragon's teeth again, and that they are just made of steel box tubing. And I drew different flesh or points to them, and took them to a nearby forge who molded them into those shapes. But the basic box tubes couldn't be more standard. Similarly, the slates on Orexis, I just picked out of traffic calming pallets when I was at Delabole Quarry, and in those days, 25 years ago, going to a quarry was simpler than it is now. No sign-in, no helmets, no need to be accompanied by a member of staff, so you could just suit yourself really and take time. But I arrived back with these one day in the back of my car, and Cyril happened to be there, and he said to me, where be they going? So I pointed to the field opposite the house, and I said, over there. Not where the sheep be. Yes, 'twill snap like carrots. So that is why you see the metal dragon's teeth in the field, and the slates are in the garden proper, but very inexpensive. And these are even smaller little slates that I picked out of pallets in Delabole Quarry. And so you just see that you can use stones, just place them in the right way, and they assume a presence very, very willingly. Here you have the miniature classical landscape of Troezen across the stream. And I just used 3 very small slates to make the facade of a classical temple, and 2 others to make markers. The whole installation, the materials probably cost no more than £10–12, something like that. On the other hand, in the Imbros enclosure, I'm not going to recommend that you take on the big stones here, but the 20 centimeter slate walling stones are quite an efficient way of making a pattern in the ground if you wish to do so. And beyond that, there are the white 10 centimeter cubes, white granite, which also can be used quite effectively to make a good pattern in the ground. And this is a snatch block, which I have positioned upside down. It was a mooring device for ships, and I found that in a marine reclamation yard in Crediton. This is just a piece of agricultural equipment that was lying around that I use in the Lerna enclosure as a resurrection standard. And here are some slightly bigger, 5 foot high, but heavy, standing stone slates. Here they represent the Muses. But I think you could easily fit that into even a town garden if you had the right place and it was something that you felt you really wanted to do. Now, I'm just going to end because I feel I've seriously underestimated how important plants are in this garden. And I'm the only full-time gardener here. So my hands are always dirty, planting, weeding, pruning, and so on. And I just want to show a very few slides to correct that balance a little bit. This is one of the glades around Hades, and you can see Cornus edis white wanda in flower, and behind that the Serbian spruce, Pachia omorica, and just to its left, in the shape of a shuttlecock, Sorbus scalaris, and to the left of that Ace, the red-leaved plant, Acer bloodgood. And there's all sorts of hydrangeas around here as well. Then in the Eleusis enclosure, you have hellebores and snowdrops, which are planted under Cornus kesselringii with the dark crimson twigs in the winter. And in the lower half of the Eleusis enclosure, you have this miniature fritillary meadow, which like it there because the ground is very damp. And then finally of all, in a completely different situation, high up on the south-facing side of the valley, you have this area of late summer planting with agastache in the foreground and Verbena bonariensis and Heleniums and so on further on. And the verbena seeds itself freely, and freely means everywhere, but I allow it and I rather love it. So I would thank you very, very much for listening to me. And I don't know that I really have very much to recommend because everything with me is so experimental. But if I had to say two things, one would be, of course, wherever you garden, find out as much as you possibly can from a horticultural point of view about your site and what's suitable to it. And then I would say, if you want to make a garden, insofar as you possibly can, invest your whole experience of life in it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Alasdair.
Thank you, Alasdair. Thank you. That was wonderful. Very very special. Now we have a number of questions. Question from Wendy. Did you have a master plan or vision right from the beginning? And I think that is something that
I didn't. I mean, I had the master plan that I definitely wanted to make a garden, and quite quickly I understood that I wanted to extend the garden into almost the whole site. But I was very timid, you know, when I first came here. You know, I was a Londoner and so on. And my gardener, Cyril, who wasn't exactly my gardener to begin with, but he was around. And he's been the most amazing support, he and his family. I mean, the garden would not be the garden if it were not for him. And he knew, or he had many, many local contacts. So he knew people who had diggers, he knew people who had every kind of agricultural equipment and so on. And so through Cyril, I gradually started to understand that you actually didn't have to cut all the field hedges by hand, but a tractor could come in and do it, and it did all the field hedges in a day. And I started to realize, you know, for instance, the lake, which was made in 1994, I came here in 1992. And so the garden's coming up for 30 years old. But, you know, the lake was made in 4 to 5 days or something. You know, I got more confident when I realized what could be done from that point of view. And I was always very aware of the frame of the valley. So the name of the garden, the place that is between, essentially commemorates that fact of topography, that I was in a valley. So I always knew that. And I'd read and of course respected that if possible, you should do nothing for a year when you go to a garden, because you have so much to learn about the site, the soil conditions, the weather, or everything. And it was about after I'd been here a year that the dedication of the front garden to Artemis and the courtyard, the main courtyard to Hermes, came about more or less at the same time, and the lake was made soon after. So I gradually expanded into the whole valley, and it's not true to say that I did one area. I didn't do the walled garden, finish it, and then move on to the courtyard, and then move on to something else. I mean, several things would happen in parallel. But in answer to your question of whether I had, no, I really grew into the valley, or as I like to say, the valley grew into me. I mean, I'm very fond of people who think that we always like to think we can set ourselves up as the interpreters, but I think very often it's the phenomena that interpret us, and so I felt the valley was playing through me really, and as I said, I tried. Once I got an overall conception, it was this notion of there being three vessels that helped me to unite the very square form of the courtyards and the open V of the valley. So I don't know if that answers your question, but there was no master plan. I mean, no, there wasn't.
Following on from that, is the garden in any way finished, or do you what further developments?
Well, I mean, I know you being a great plantsman are the last person to imagine a garden is ever finished.
Absolutely.
One is constantly
not in terms of planting, but in terms of structures and.
I'm not anticipating it becoming any bigger, because how old am I now? 73, I think. And Cyril is in his 70s too, so you've got a major rethink coming up one day. But I mean, no maintenance, as is always the case, I think, as any garden matures, and a particularly large garden, maintenance becomes very, very time consuming. So I think it would be over-ambitious. I was at one point, I mean, the fields, when we were looking over the Ha-Ha, there was a snowy view into the distance. And some years ago, those fields, unfortunately, as part of a bigger holding, came on the market, and I couldn't afford to buy the whole lot. But I would like to have bought those fields, because then there's a cascade, which we haven't been looking at, but right at the end, below the Ha-Ha. And they would have allowed one to look into the cascade, which one can't actually do as things are. So, I mean, if that, maybe if that ever came up and suddenly I had a windfall from somewhere, I mean, I probably wouldn't be able to resist buying those fields. But no. What I have been doing, though, because of ash dieback, and there are so many ash trees in the hedges here, so where the hedge is quite an important shelter for more choice plants that are growing on the leeward side of it. I mean, this last winter, for example, I planted about 100 balsam poplars and then a laurel hedge to encase the ashes in the hedge died. So there's always things like that, and yes, and I don't think that the garden is ever finished, but I'm not. There are no big ambitious plans to make it a lot bigger.
Alasdair, can I ask you, having grown up on Exmoor, what drew you?
Did you grow up?
Yes, I certainly did, and very moving it is to hear the story in the garden and see it. And I'm very lucky to have been there a good few years ago now. But what drew you to that part of the world originally?
Well, it's a very good question, and serendipity is really the answer. In that, when I came back from the Lake District, I was in London. And I had a house in Richmond, but I was mainly in Portman Square because my father had died. And I started looking for a garden. And I knew I wanted to be outside the orbit of London, by which I mean I didn't want to feel people were commuting to London. And of course, these days, people commute from huge distances. So for those of you who don't know the south of England, Devon, which is where I am, is about 200 miles west of London. And there's a major motorway that goes north-south called the M5. And although I considered West Dorset, which is actually on the London side of the motorway, because West Dorset is quite remote and doesn't have brilliant transport. But once you got west of the M5, things felt totally different from how they feel in the rest of the south of England. But I also looked in Shropshire, but when I came, I didn't know this area at all, Annie. And I'd gone to bits of Devon, in my discovery of gardens, but there are not very many gardens where I am because it's quite a harsh part of Devon. But what I discovered was that precisely because it wasn't a very rich part of Devon, so it wasn't the coast and it wasn't the moor, so it hadn't been a great tourist area. There were quite a lot of small holdings that had about 30 acres, and sometimes with a slightly upgraded farmhouse like mine. So it was really the land tenure that allowed me to buy what I wanted, because Dorset was either too expensive, it was too grand. You either had a nice rectory at the end of a village. It was the same in Shropshire. You had a rectory at the edge of a village with an acre or two, or something impossibly grand. And in Dorset, anything which had a lot of land was just very expensive. So, but I mean, I really woke up to this area. And of course, when you first arrive in those days, I didn't have a garden, so I was free and I could travel and I could explore what was all around. I mean, I never explore anything now.
Got time to get anywhere.
But I mean, no, I loved the area.
It's very good.
And I, first of all, I tried to buy a house right at the north of Exmoor. And it was very beautiful, and a river ran through it, and there were otters and so forth. But in the end, I'm glad I wasn't able to get it, because it was almost in what's called the Lorna Doone Valley, which is incredibly picturesque, but with very, very tiny roads. And in the summer, it driven me mad. And also where I am, you can actually get to Exeter in 35, 40 minutes. And so I'm still enough of a Londoner that I quite like to be near a university city. So that sense that I wanted intense seclusion is true, but I mean, but I'm also, and I can get to another town called Tiverton, and the train from there is about 2.25 hours to London. So I'm not that far away. But no, I mean,
there are lots of lovely comments, and what we'll do, Alasdair, is we'll send you the comments, because there's pure poetry. Alice from Milan is saying, and everybody is I think in awe and.
Well, no, but please, well, I hope please come. Maybe not from South Carolina, but
your plans, obviously we don't. Is all very uncertain at the moment. What are your plans for opening next year?
Well, I mean, there is now a website, which is quite a new thing, www.plazmetaxu.com, and it's possible to contact me indirectly through that. And what I'm tending to do is, anybody who sends me a request, I tell them I'm making a note of their email, and as soon as the garden is able to open again, I will let them all know. And
let's hope we can organise a garden masterclass.
I think we'd like to do. We have been talking about that, haven't we?
Yeah. But Alasdair, you've been terribly modest.
And there is a book. There is a book.
Oh, this is it. You haven't mentioned that yet.
I think you ought to mention the book. But
here is the book. Here is the book. Everybody.
So which only just came out.
Yeah.
If I could just pin.
I mean, the real reason why I'm mentioning the book is because it is a much fuller account than I'm able to give you here.
Lovely.
So,
well, Noel, will you put the title of the book into the chat?
Yeah, I'm trying to. I've got a screen share of it somewhere.
Oh, lovely.
Yes.
Well, was it a lady or a gentleman who sent an email from Italy? I can't remember whether
it was Alice from it's Alice from Milan. She's a landscape architect in Milan.
Oh, wonderful.
Well, pure poetry, yeah.
She may be interested to know that the first thing that I ever published on this garden, I mean, it's the only other thing I've ever published, through a friend. I knew the lady who was the editor of the Mediterranean Garden Journal, who lived outside Athens. And at some point, after I'd been here for about 7 years or something, but the Hermes Courtyard had been made, she was canvassing anybody in England who had anything remotely Mediterranean in their gardens to submit it for an article. So I wrote about the Hermes Courtyard. And Caro, who was very, she was a novelist. I mean, she was very educated and everything. So she hummed and hawed, and she was somewhat agonized because I'd written a description of the courtyard, and then there was all the mythological stuff and so on. And in the end, she said, I'm just so sorry, Alasdair, but on the whole, I think the readers of the Mediterranean Garden magazine, when they see the word Hermes, will think silk scarves. So I think I can only publish the first half of what you wrote, which was the physical description. But I've had some wonderful visitors from Italy, Alice, and in fact, one was a glass sculptor, and he is the only person who, when I made a quotation from Hölderlin in German, he gave me the next line.
Oh.
I was in paradise. And so Italian visitors are absolutely 100% welcome.
Oh, well, perhaps, Alasdair, you're missing a trick. You should speak to Hermes in Paris and get them to print the map of the garden on a silk scarf.
Oh, gosh.
And I think you could tell
merchandising, yes.
Tell them.
Plaz Metaxu range.
Yes, yeah.
Good. So the book is now out, published by Pimpernel Press.
Yep.
Very impressive volume, actually.
It's quite a dense read, but there's lots of photographs.
Yeah.
And
I want to compliment you on the photographs in your presentation were just extraordinary, because that's all your work.
Well, I should actually thank you so much for reminding me, because I would think, yes, 85% of those are mine, but I also have used some of Andrew Lawson and Neil Hepworth, and I definitely should mention that.
Right.
Because they've been extraordinarily kind to me, and in the book they've allowed me to use their photographs without charge, as has Jo Whitworth, but I didn't actually use one of hers in this presentation.
Right.
But thank you so much for
No, well, it was just visually.
But I mean, that's very important. That's in the book and indeed in the garden. I mean, it's so important to me to try to have as intimate a dialogue as possible between image and idea, and it's hard. I mean, it's very hard to do that. But I'm sorry that in the presentation, which I didn't realize, it must happen when it's being transferred, that there was this delay between, when I start talking about a slide, and it doesn't come up for a few seconds.
That does seem to happen. It does seem to be a bit of a sort of an ongoing problem, I'm afraid.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't too serious, because I just when I thought people would be getting fed up, the new one came on screen just in the nick of time. So I thought, thank goodness for that. But but so please, I try never to say no to people, except this year, when they want to come to the garden. So you would all be very welcome.
That's wonderful. Well,
Well,
let's.
thank you. And we will, I think, Annie, we will try and organise something, possibly autumn next year, maybe this time of year, next year.
Let's do it.
Great. Thank you so much, Alasdair. That was really, really wonderful.
Thank all of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a lovely, lovely evening.
Keep in touch.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much. Bye-bye then.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Thanks,
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.